Good morning, Will. It is great to talk to you live about some new, or I suppose revised information and recommendations from the Ball technical team related to Impatiens Downy Mildew and some guidelines for growers looking to optimize impatiens crops using an effective fungicide rotation. And I suppose we're going to talk about using data in general to produce your best crops, and you're going to give us some tips and tricks for reading some of these charts and really understanding how to design the best rotation using the information, right?
Right, because it seemed like a good time to bring up this topic of how do you take data that we're overwhelmed with and turn it into an actionable program that will be effective in your greenhouse. There's a couple of growers around North America that are experiencing Impatiens Downy Mildew, with more growers producing impatiens than they have, say, 3-4 years ago when we really didn't have any problems. Some growers are starting to see a few more problems with Impatiens Downy Mildew, also because growers in the north are holding crops, waiting for the season to break. So there's a lot of reasons why there might be seeing a little more Impatiens Downy Mildew than the past. So I thought this would be a great time for us to take all of this information that Colleen Warfield, who is the Ball corporate plant pathologist, has researched over the last, she's been working on 5-6 years. She's probably killed more impatiens than anyone else in the world because she's been very active at looking at what chemicals work, how long do they work, what's the best strategies. And so she's pulled it all into a big table. And of course, now you look at the table and say, now what? So that's pretty much what we want to do, is take a look at data, because if you pick up the Grower Talk special editions on fungicides and insecticides, there's all these tables with all this information, but how do you make it work? That's probably the biggest question I keep getting growers asking me, is how do I make this work? So let's talk a little bit about that, Bill.
Sounds good. So, I mean, the revised charts and guidelines, like you said, are this fantastic resource. They're very in-depth. So how do you suggest growers would use this information, just sort of from a big picture perspective?
Well, when you start looking at your crop, this is all about risk management. You have to basically be looking at what kind of risks are you willing to have within your operation? What kind of risks exist in your operation? Do you have environmental risks? Do you have varieties? If you grow poinsettias, you know that poinsettias are going to have whiteflies. It's kind of the way it works. So therefore, you basically have to get the chemicals in place to manage that risk. So what I think we're going to look at is look at the data that Colleen has prepared for us, see what kind of risk you have in your greenhouse. Do you have a high risk because you have environments, you're using susceptible varieties versus high resistant varieties? Do you have basically disease pressure in the greenhouse? What are all the different risks that you have? And then how do you fashion the appropriate fungicide program to manage that risk? Because as all good growers, you don't want to spend more money on chemicals than you need to, but you want the right chemicals to give you the results when you invest the time and effort to do the spraying. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at, is what are the factors that define the risk, and then how do you manage that risk within your facility?
Okay, so you're getting the most bang for your buck and the most bang for your time and effort invested into these crops. So I think that really does provide an excellent overview. So let's look at exactly what a spray program looks like, with the goal of controlling disease, and in this case, specifically Impatiens Downy Mildew. So how do growers turn the charts, these new charts, into an actionable spray program? I think you're going to show us some slides that you put together to illustrate the process.
Right, and if growers are interested in reviewing these slides afterwards, where can they find those, Bill?
We will have them posted at ballseed.com in the culture and production guide section, and we'll put a link in the description in this video. And then we'll also be sharing this through our social media on LinkedIn and through our Facebook Greenhouse Tech Team Facebook page.
Right. So basically, there's a lot of places for you to go back and review this if you need additional information. But so what we want to try to do today is basically help you understand how to turn data into an effective spray program. Because if we take a look at the table to the right, which is the table of all the data, one of the biggest challenges we face is that, a bunch of us pointy head researchers get together and we collect the information, and we have ways that we present the information. And the grower community usually ends up going, oh, that's really nice, but what does this all mean? So
Exactly.
yeah, so what we're going to try to do today is take this table of information that's really important in designing a program and look at it as, what is that critical fungicide information? What should you look at? What does it mean? What are the different strategies based on the activity of the chemical? What is the crop time? How many sprays can you actually effectively put on due to just limited amount of opportunities? And what should those be? What are your different options for putting it? And then we're going to give you an idea of what a Impatiens Downy Mildew program might look like. And finally, we'll finish up with the all-important crop phytotoxicity, because far too many growers just grab chemicals, spray them, and then go, oops. So we want to really talk about some of the known oopses before we get too far into the program. So that's kind of where we're going to go, Bill. Does that seem like a good place to head off?
Definitely. So why don't you start sharing your screen and we will take a look at some of these tables.
Okay. There we go. How do we basically turn a table into a program? So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about here today. I highlighted those information. So let's take a look at what is some of that critical information. One of the first pieces of information that is really important is the FRAC code. It's the mode of action. The FRAC stands for the Fungicide Resistant Action Committee. This is a group of plant pathologists who basically have gotten together and have come up with these FRAC codes. That what it tells you is, if you take a look at your FRAC codes, it's a number or letter that basically says this group of chemicals that may have the same active ingredient, say in the case of mancozeb, but different product names, Protect DF, Dithane, 75DF. If you're in Canada, all of the chemicals are in pink, and so that it's called Dithane in Canada as a form of mancozeb. Now, what is the problem is that if you basically rotate between Protect DF and Dithane 75DF, you're spraying the same active ingredient and resistance can occur. So what we always want to be doing in our fungicide program is be very aware of what is the FRAC code and what combination of FRAC codes are we using. Are you using an 11 and a 4? Are you using a 21 and an 11? If you're spraying Pageant, which is an 11 and a 7, you don't want to be spraying Heritage because it's exactly the same compound, active ingredient is, and they're in the mode of action, so you might have resistance or not as effective spray or drench or whatever how you're applying it. So look at the FRAC codes, understand it, make sure that you're moving through various FRAC codes to get the best mode of action. The next thing that we want to be looking at is the activity. How does the fungicide react within the plant? Is it a contact? Is it a chemical that is, when you put it on the surface, it basically prevents the spore or the bacteria from developing and invading the tissue? In the case of downy mildew, if you've got a contact and you spray all the contact on the top, that's really not going to be effective because you've got the spores on the underside of the leaf. So you need to make sure that if it's a contact, that you're basically spraying the top and the bottom of the leaf to give you full protection. If it is a systemic, remember that the systemics move within the plant, meaning that normally you apply it to the soil and they're upward systemic. There's only a couple of compounds that are downward systemic. The vast majority of them are from the roots up through the plant. So you want to make sure that you're going to apply these systemic materials as a drench. They're okay as a spray, but the best of efficacy is as a drench. Then if it's translaminar. Now, translaminar is an important term to fully understand. Translaminar, Bill, means that when you spray it to a leaf, it will move within the leaf. It doesn't normally move out of the leaf, it's just in the leaf. So if you've got, say, an Impatiens, and why this is very important to understand, and you spray it on Monday, the plants are unfolding leaves all week long, so that by the time you get to the following Monday, you've got a brand new leaf that's fully unfolded, and that leaf is not protected. So if you've got active spores in the operation and you're concerned, you're putting on just translaminars, well, what's happening is that translaminar is basically going to be treating the older leaves that you treated, but those young leaves that have just unfolded, they're untreated, so therefore they're susceptible to being infected with the Impatiens Downy Mildew. So really understand the whole translaminar, or is it systemic, or is it just a contact? Because that is the basis of how often do you spray, how do you apply. It really is a core piece of information that without that, you're going to probably apply the chemical ineffectively and not get the benefit that you want. Does that make sense, Bill?
It does, and I think that the takeaway to remember, especially with translaminar, is that you need to be very cognizant of when those new leaves are unfolding and then reapply.
Yeah, perfect. The next thing we need to know is, should this be done as a spray or drench? One of the problems that we run into with drenches is the big question that people always miss is how wet is the soil at the time that you drench? If you have a pot or a container that basically is saturated, so it's a level 5 moisture, then you apply the drench, which you should apply it to a drip, okay, so that you get at least, so you're sure that it moves all the way to the bottom. If the soil is already saturated, you're not going to be putting on very much solution, and it's going to be diluted by the water that's in the soil. Make sense?
Yeah, so that reaction and the way that it moves through the plant makes a huge difference.
Right, because you're just not going to have as much active ingredient per pot. Conversely, if you've got a really bone dry pot and you have to water it to the point where you get a drip, you're going to put a lot of chemical into that pot. So your active ingredient is probably way too high, and so you stand the risk of having phytotoxicity issues. So, you want to make sure that the soil moisture is a level 4, and a level 4 is so that you basically can get, when you water the plants, you have at least a drip. The top of the soil is a dark brown to brown, and the bottom, if you knock the plant out of the pot, you can actually see that it's darker brown on the bottom. That's a nice level 4, so that when you apply it, you can get uniform moisture through the pot, and you end up without putting on too much. So it's kind of the 3 bears method of drenching. You don't want it too wet, you don't want it too dry, you want it just right. Then that way you're going to have the right amount of chemical in the pot to get the best uptake. The last thing that we need to be looking at is how long does the chemical remain active within that container. What Colleen has done and a number of other people have done is they give you a residual efficacy greater than 7 days. So for example, the more check marks, the more stars, the longer it is effective after the 7-day treatment. So if you can be effective more than 7 days, that quickly tells you, okay, well then I can basically don't have to be spraying every single week. If I've got a chemical that's barely effective, say for Heritage was barely effective for 7 days, you probably have got to be out there every 7 days, or you're going to end up with a gap that leaves the plant unprotected. Also, be very cognizant of these little footnotes. In the case of Subdue Max, you can have, there's some toxicity issues as a spray if applied incorrectly, and then we also have seen some resistance in certain parts to this particular chemical. So watch your footnotes, a lot of information there to help you understand how frequently do you have to apply, and also how you basically need to be cautious about what you're doing so that you don't end up with problems. So when we put it all together, we know about rotations through the frac code, we know activity, telling us where to apply it, where it's being moved within the plant. We know whether we should do it as a spray or a drench, and we also know what is our overall efficacy. So we've got these 4 very critical pieces of information. So are we ready, Bill, now to go and move on to start putting a program together?
Yeah, and as you were talking about the residual efficacy, I was thinking that's really going to help you understand how to time your spray program. And then taking all these pieces of information and putting them together is the key to success.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at putting all the pieces together. And of course, what's the most important part of putting a fungicide program together, Bill.
Well, it's understanding this entire environment and your risk.
Right. It's the plant disease triangle that we've got here on the screen, which is a combination of the plant. In this case, we've got impatiens, which there are high resistant varieties, Beacon, Amara. There are all the rest of Wallerianas are susceptible. And of course, we all know that impatiens, New Guineas, are resistant. Well, they're not really classified as resistant. They're classified as immune. They don't get Impatiens Downy Mildew on New Guineas, on patients, because they don't have the correct genetics. They don't have Walleriana blood in them. So really, if the plant is a plant that's susceptible, we need to make sure that we're paying attention. If we have the pathogen, in this case, it is the downy mildew pathogen, that's also very important to understand. And of course, if you've got the right environmental conditions, which is high relative humidity, and you've got the right temperatures, which are pretty much the ideal temperature for impatiens to grow. So if you've got all three of them occurring, you've got the situation where you could end up with a disease outbreak. And of course, what's the easiest way to prevent that is to eliminate one of those factors, or applying a fungicide, which basically will break the plant environment and pathogen triangle so that you don't end up with the disease taking off. So it's important that we look at that and ask ourselves, are we at risk? Are we at high risk because we have all three of them present in our greenhouse? So therefore, we need to be having a frequent application. If this is a medium risk, where we only intermittently have these problems, where we have all three of the pathogen, the plant, and the environment there, we have a medium risk, and we need to be looking at it, just protecting the plants for those occasions when all three factors are in play. If we basically eliminate the plant, basically the susceptible plant from the triangle, or we eliminate the environment, we grow under really low relative humidity conditions, or we have no pathogen present in the greenhouse, then we're at low risk, where we have a very limited chance for infection, and consequently, we really have a different spray strategy. So this is where the risk strategy is really important to look at when you're evaluating what should I spray, when should I spray, how often should I be spraying. The next thing we need to look at is, when we have these different risk strategy, we basically can be using a systemic at all times. So we're always protecting the plants. But if we have a high risk, we basically should be thinking about contact, and a medium risk, we probably should be also looking at translaminars to protect those plants. One of the challenges we have in the greenhouse production is the fact that we've got crop times, which, in plugs and liners, 4-week crop time, we're limited to probably 1 or 2 applications. So we've got to pick the right application. In that case, if you're only doing 1, a systemic is really critical. If you can get 2 on, you may want to be looking at a translaminar contact and a systemic, but making sure we've got that systemic on is very important. When we move into finished crops, where we've got a lot longer crop time, we're looking at 8 or longer weeks of crop time. There, you can start working 2 or 3 applications in if it's appropriate. So then you can basically start making some decisions, again, looking at the systemic, looking at, should you put on a contact and plus a translaminar. Looking at what your application options are, if you're doing a spray, making sure that you're getting the full treatment of that plant, both the top and the bottom. And just like a translaminar, if you get new leaves that have not been sprayed, those leaves are not protected. So when you're doing a spray treatment that is, especially if it's a contact, you have to be treating it top and bottom frequently to make sure all of the leaves are protected. Same is true with the translaminar with a spray. If you're doing a drench, especially with a systemic, remember that gives you protection both into old foliage and into the young developing leaves, so that you get a little bit longer protection with a drench than you will with a spray. That's why we're advocating using the systemic drench along with contact sprays or translaminar sprays. Remember always that dry soil, you can run into phytotoxicity symptoms, and with a saturated soil, you may say, well, it doesn't work. Well, it's because you've diluted the active ingredient within that pot. So those are kind of the three top line issues of what is your strategy based on your risk, how long of time do you have to work with, and how are you going to apply them. So let's take a look, Bill, at putting this together into a program. Really, you've got, whether you're young plant producing or you're finished, you need to make sure that you've got protection of that product all the way through your production cycle. Most all of your young plant producers are actively spraying because they know the risk, and you as a finished producer need to also engage. You've got a couple different strategies depending upon how much time you have. If you're looking at a spray program because you've got a little bit more time for your young plants, looking at translaminar and a contact as a spray, looking at Adorn plus Protect DF. We like Adorn early in the crop because there are some indications that you could end up with flower phytotoxicity with some Adorn. So get it on early. As we see we have good longevity of protection after 7 days, the same with Protect DF. So that gives you kind of that early spray, early crop protection. Then as we get to the end of the cycle before we're moving it on to finished, we really want to be looking at probably your most effective chemical is Segovis as a drench. That basically has been shown to give you longer term control so that you're protecting yourself beyond 7 days quite effectively. And if you don't have Segovis, make sure that you're using something like Subdue Max plus Adorn again. You could be using Mycora in there as a spray if you wanted to, but getting Subdue Max plus Adorn if you don't have Segovis. The Canadians, it is not labeled Segovis, so you're going to have to use something like Subdue Max plus Adorn. As we move on to the finished plants, as soon as those plants are transplanted, and again, you want to make sure that you get roots out there. So until you've got a good root system out there to take up a systemic, you want to make sure that you're putting on this translaminar plus contact. Pageant plus Protect DF is effective. Mycora by itself, Segway by itself. In constructing your spray program, you need to choose one of those 3 compounds, or if you've got multiple, you can put on 3 sprays. You may want to be putting on 2 of those a week apart or 10 days apart. So depending upon how much time you have, you can pick 1, 2, or even all 3 of those if necessary because of the type of risk that you have in your operation. Always remember that we're looking at the benefit to the consumer. And so therefore we want good control of any downy mildew, because when the consumer takes it, they might be exposing their plants to a high risk environment where they've got other impatiens that have downy mildew basically in their flowering beds. So you want to make sure that you drench them with Segovis as they're going out the door to give them that kind of protection. Segovis isn't available as in Canada. Make sure that you put on a Subdue Max plus K-Fight. It's a very effective systemic, and that gives you control out in the landscape, which is very important. Always be thinking of, am I putting a contact on? Do I get a contact? Do I have a translaminar? Do I have a systemic? Am I hitting all 3 so that I can give the best control overall? For those from Canada, make sure that you check what are the appropriate Canadian chemicals. Remember the chart that we showed earlier, it basically, those highlighted in pink are the appropriate Canadian chemicals. So Bill, does that give us a good idea of what some suggestions are for whether you're growing young plants or finished? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And it's like you said in the previous slide. It's about assessing your level of risk and then developing the program. And I like what you said about it needs to look good and perform in the consumer's garden or in a landscape bed where the pressure might be quite a bit higher than in a greenhouse. So anything that you can do on the way out the door to ensure success is going to, benefit everybody, I think, long term. And earlier you mentioned potential for phytotoxicity, and I think that maybe we'll wrap up with a little bit of information about phyto and some things to look for and how to avoid this problem.
Right, and I think this is a good example of where you basically have phytotoxicity. Ridamil, the grower decided that they were going to put it on at a very high rate. The soil was dry. because they were really concerned. And of course, then they end up with classic Ridamil subdue phytotoxicity, which is basically exactly what you're seeing here, the chlorosis on the margin of the leaf. Some people may think this is good, some people may think it's bad. Remember, always run a trial on a small block. How many plants do you want to kill with this new chemical, this new rate, before you basically start spraying the whole block? Try it on a small block, give it about 4 to 7 days, and after that, if you don't see anything, you're good to go. Make sure that you always check your rates and check your new chemicals in your facility, because there's a lot of moving parts that impact the overall phytotoxicity. Remember, right rate equals control. Make sure that you're applying the drench so that it's not diluted because the soil was too wet, or it's concentrated because the soil was too dry. So make sure that you're putting it on at the right rate for that particular chemical. Here's a good example of someone that treated the impatiens on the right, the pink impatiens on the right, with Protect DF. Awesome, great contact, but unfortunately they weren't very careful and ended up spraying marigolds, which are highly toxic to manganese, which is what is in mancozeb. Mancozeb is a combination of manganese and zinc, and high application rates of that are very toxic to marigolds. So be aware of what you should and shouldn't be spraying. Some of the other things that we've had from grower comments is, of course, this comment about adorn flowers, distortion, and then also we've seen some stature as a drench when it's applied to drier soil. And of course, we do want to just remind everyone that Florel, which people will use on impatiens at times, you can get leaf distortion and stunting if applied incorrectly. So there's a number of different chemicals that can give you phytotoxicity, and of course, you as a grower are responsible for checking out, is my method of application, is my rate correct? So does that kind of give us a good idea, Bill, of what's all happening out there with putting together a program?
I think so. You take all that good information in the charts, and then you start thinking about your own specific situation in your greenhouse. I mean, what you said about trialing and testing small blocks, I mean, that is good practice no matter what you're spraying or what you're looking to control. I think that you did give a good overview of how to use some of this data. I mean, those charts are pretty intense, and there's a lot of information in them, a lot of chemicals, but talking about the rotation and the different frac codes. I mean, that's sort of something that we all need to refresh on and continue to, study as we are looking for different ways to control problems in the greenhouse. I think that it was really clear and concise and to the point. Again, remember that the revised guidelines can be found at ballseed.com. If you go into the top drop-down menu under catalogs and brochures, just click on production guidelines. You're going to find a trove of information about all sorts of insect problems, disease problems, and it's where we post a lot of good information. There's even certain tools that you can use for height tracking on poinsettias. There's all sorts of great information there. And also on Ball Seed's LinkedIn page, just look for Ball Seed. And then to ask any questions or to continue this discussion with Will and other members of the technical team, you're encouraged to join the Greenhouse Tech Team Facebook page. If you're on Facebook, just search Greenhouse Tech Team. We'll ask you a couple questions just to qualify that you're an industry professional. We'll get you approved, and you'll be ready to go very quickly. So, Will, I really appreciate all your time. I know that you guys spend a lot of time helping growers understand this information, and I appreciate that you came on live to share some tips and tricks for reading this in-depth information.
Yep. Well, thanks a lot, Bill, for hosting it, and hopefully growers will now have a much more effective program. Whether they're doing a fungicide program or if you check the Grower Talk special editions. For insects, there's IRAC, IRAC, a similar kind of mode of action, designation and grouping, so that you can basically tailor a program that's more effective for your insect and disease control. So thanks a lot, Bill, and hopefully we'll hear from growers.
Definitely, and we will talk again soon. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill.